Welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist on Facebook Live, where we attempt to answer some common questions about atheism, about free thinkers, and about state-church separation. I'm Dan Barker. I'm co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces this weekly show.
And I'm Patrick Elliott, one of the senior attorneys at the Freedom from Religion Foundation, working to keep state and church separate and to educate the public about the views of non-theists.
And I'm Ryan Jane, another one of the 9 attorneys here at FFRF. And today we are going to be talking about Brett Kavanaugh's nomination hearings for the Supreme Court.
Okay, but before we do that, let's have a little bit of fun. Remember before the show there was that loud generator noise? It was, Buzz was saying he could hear it in our microphone. And just before the show started, I put up my hands and said, I command you to stop in the name of whatever. And what happened?
You still got it.
It stopped. I still have the power of God, right, to stop. Well, the hurricane is approaching the East Coast. And let's look at what Pat Robertson thinks he could do about a hurricane.
I don't want that thing to come in. I don't want it to hurt Region. I don't want it to hurt CBN. I don't want it to tear up these beautiful campus. I don't want to tear these trees down. I don't want to see any damage. I don't want a bunch of glass flowing. And I don't want all over this area that's counting on us to pray for them. So I'm going to ask you right now, put your hand out toward the Atlantic, wherever it is, and let's speak a word right now. In the name of Jesus. In the name of Jesus, you Hurricane Florence, we speak to you in the name of Jesus, and we command this storm to cease its forward motion and go harmlessly into the Atlantic. Go up north, away from land, and veer off in the name of Jesus. We declare in the name of the Lord that you shall go no farther, you shall do no damage in this area. We declare a shield of protection all over Tidewater. And we declare...
It's funny, whenever Pat Robertson's praying, it looks to me like he's pushing really hard. It's trying to force something to happen in the cosmos.
It also is seemed very self-interested prayer. It's not, no, don't harm anyone, hurricane. It was, protect this place, don't break our windows, don't take our trees. It just seemed like a very selfish prayer, if you will, if obviously it's ridiculous, but it wasn't of concern for, people that are potentially in harm's way.
When you went to Catholic Church, did they pray like that?
That was not how we prayed.
No?
No.
You prayed in Latin or something?
It was pre-programmed prayers by the church. They didn't like a lot of the free-form praying like that.
You couldn't redirect a tornado coming to Wisconsin? None of that stuff?
Well, I have to say, as someone who never went to church, was never religious, it's so crazy to me to see that kind of atmosphere. And I just have to wonder, he's always got this grin on his face when he's delivering the prayer. Like, does he know that when this doesn't work, when the hurricane just crashes into the coast, that he's going to just move on and never have to deal with trying to justify why his magical powers didn't come to fruition, and all the people in the audience who are participating, and how many of them actually think that they're having any effect? It's such a foreign idea.
Well, and then he said, put your hand toward the Atlantic, wherever that is, he said. Right. He didn't know where he was. But as if somehow human beings have this laser force thing that if you put your hand in this direction, it's going to push the hurricane away. It's like, so human-centered and...
Well, you'd think if he believed it, too, he would have clarified that. He would say, I don't want to push this the wrong way. Can someone tell me for sure which way is the Atlantic? And so the fact that he's just saying,
yeah, let's
point it toward the Atlantic, we'll say it's this way.
Maybe he did push it further in. Right. Maybe by doing... Well, I think it was about 20 years ago, another hurricane was coming toward Virginia Beach, and he prayed that God would move it. And actually it did move. After he prayed, it moved further north, and it destroyed some other communities up there rather than them. And he took that as a sign of the power of God to...
Well, the Old Testament's full of death and destruction, right? So I guess it all lines up.
Yeah. And besides, who's responsible for that hurricane in the first place?
Right.
Didn't God... isn't that God's nature? And who are we to interfere with God's plan? But anyway, I think, believe it or not, I think even though Pat Robertson and those people are deluded, seriously deluded, I think they're sincere. I think Pat Robertson really, really believes what he's preaching. I mean, it doesn't mean he's not insane, but I mean, he really sincerely believes that these things can happen. And when they do happen, he takes it as proof. And when they don't, well, you just ignore it when the failures. So.
Yeah, mysterious ways.
So another hurricane, another big storm that's approaching our country is the attack on the United States Supreme Court by the religious right. And when Trump was campaigning, he promised that he would nominate justices to the Supreme Court who would overturn Roe and that would push evangelical Christian values. And attorneys here at FFRF have been watching this confirmation. We've been watching it carefully for a number of reasons over the months. But you, Ryan, especially, and Andrew
Seidel. Yes.
Andrew Seidel, who's not here today.
Right.
Have you watched the whole thing?
Yep, I watched every single second of the hearings, and they were interesting at points, dry at others. But yeah, there was a lot of alarm about Brett Kavanaugh, and continues to be, and for a very good reason. I mean, we were sounding the alarm about Justice Gorsuch, and people thought, well, he is an originalist and a textualist. He's not going to overturn precedent. And then immediately when he went on the court, after assuring senators that he wouldn't touch established precedent, he immediately went back on that promise and started just rewriting decisions that they thought were wrong. And so that's really, really alarming. And so here we are again with Kavanaugh. As soon as he was nominated, we dug really deep into finding everything we could about his history, and our conclusion was very clearly that this guy is going to be a nightmare for state-church separation, and he's not very coy about that. It's really clear, actually, and so we've been smashing the panic button ever since then. And now that the hearings have been going on, we're paying very close attention, a lot of very revealing things, especially because, so I actually was on the show talking about Kavanaugh when he was first nominated, and I remember we got a question that was basically saying, this is alarmist, he's not going to be that big of a deal, he's a good judge, there's nothing to worry about. And I hope that whoever sent that question, and anyone else who is thinking that way, if you're paying attention, you should know that we have not been alarmist about this. If anything, people are just not excited enough about how dangerous this guy is going to be.
Have you been watching too, Patrick? Or?
We've been watching. I mean, I think why it's an appropriate time to pay attention is because these are lifetime appointments. And, we're seeing, just for instance, we have a judge, and that's true for all federal judgeships. In one of our cases that FFRF is litigating, we have a judge that's 92 years old. This is a serious commitment at this point in time to put somebody on the court for that length of time, especially when their views don't line up with much of what the public's views are, particularly on the state church issues that we care about, access to contraceptives, access to abortion. These are issues that Brett Kavanaugh is not in accord with what the public thinks, but he's about to potentially get a lifetime appointment. So I think we've all been watching. I certainly haven't watched as live hearings as Ryan has been doing, but I think a lot of people have been paying more attention to this confirmation process, even more so than more recent process for Gorsuch.
Isn't Kavanaugh in his 50s?
Yeah. So if Kavanaugh gets confirmed, there is going to be a solid 5-person majority on the Supreme Court that is hostile to state church separation, that is in all likelihood going to be there for 15 years at least.
So Kavanaugh's replacing Kennedy.
Right.
Is he better or worse than Kennedy from our point of view?
I think he's clearly worse than Kennedy. So it's important to remember that, for one thing, he clerked for Kennedy. So you might be forgiven if you at first thought, well, this guy's probably, kind of in the image of Kennedy. He's going to be very similar in terms of his judicial philosophy.
Because Kennedy was more like a swing vote on the court.
Yeah, he had that reputation. He didn't like, that. He said that, the cases swing, the justices don't swing. But the reality is that that's where he was. There were, on a whole host of issues, there were 4 very solidly conservative and 4 very solidly liberal justices. And then Kennedy, who's definitely a conservative Catholic, was the person in the middle. So you saw in all sorts of cases people talking directly to Kennedy, saying, you're the person we need to convince. That proved to be true, and even though his record was very hit or miss, and from our perspective, I would say more missing than hitting, he had a couple really good moments. He wrote the Levy-Weissman decision in 1992, and he voted in favor of...
Weissman was a prayer at public schools.
Right, so it struck down a prayer at a public school graduation. And then in 2000, there's a case we can talk some more about called Santa Fe, where it was a prayer at public school football games delivered over the loudspeaker that Kennedy, again, was part of a majority to strike that practice down. And we know that Kavanaugh, he wrote an amicus brief in that case, so we know that he is disagreeing with Kennedy on that point. And also from what he's talked about holding up Rehnquist as his kind of mentor or ideal justice, and quoting his critiques of state-church separation.
Did Rehnquist dissent in Santa Fe?
Yes, he did.
And then Kavanaugh liked his dissent.
Exactly. And he has described the wall of state-church separation as being wrong as a matter of law and history. And that's a terrifying thing to say. Kennedy would not have said anything like that. Kennedy obviously upheld the idea of state-church separation, and Kavanaugh seems to be very hostile to it. And of course, that's just in the state-church angle, which is what we do. But I think it's also true of a whole host of other issues that people care a lot about. So for instance, in terms of abortion rights. Kennedy believed in Roe v. Wade clearly and in upholding the constitutional right for a woman to choose. And Kavanaugh has shown remarkable hostility toward that. So I think that the reality, you have to acknowledge that Kavanaugh is going to be much more judicially conservative than Kennedy was. And so if we're going to look at who is the new swing vote, it is not going to be Brett Kavanaugh if he gets confirmed. It's probably going to be John Roberts.
The reality is there may not be a swing vote if you have a voting block of 5 or 6 justices that are going to vote the same on a lot of these hot button issues, particularly where you have a justice like Kennedy, who sometimes would find something the government didn't violate state-church separation and other times would. I think you're going to get a more consistent Rehnquist, which is basically nothing will violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. So there really won't be a swing vote on probably a number of issues. I know we've had that court for many years, and prior to Kennedy, we've had other justices. We've had other justices that were in that mold that may not vote consistently in every single case. But I think that's the concern, is that really the court will be set against state-church separation. And you mentioned the Santa Fe case, which is a prayer at school football games case, which was, I think, a 6-3 decision by the Supreme Court. But what Kavanaugh wrote, he wrote a brief in that case basically denigrating some of the plaintiffs. And interestingly enough, those weren't just atheists. There were actually religious minorities. And I think one Catholic plaintiff, and do you recall?
Mormon.
And a Mormon, students who didn't want, basically Protestant prayers at their football games.
Or a Southern Baptist Protestant, yeah.
Right, but it's an interesting perspective that, his view was very, only the atheists maybe would take out these really an extreme position to want state-church separation. But the reality is, a lot of people in this country want state-church separation, including, students who just want to participate in school events without religion being involved. And so I think that is at risk. We know what his position was versus Justice Kennedy and other justices at the time. It's much stronger shift towards opening up public schools for religious indoctrination.
So when someone like our group asks or demands that the government be neutral, right? We think there's neutrality on religion, not for or against. Would someone like Kavanaugh interpret that neutrality as an act of hostility against religious freedom?
I mean, that's what they say in terms of what their arguments are in terms of briefing. They think, not having the school involved in religion is somehow hostile to religion. And the reality is that's neutrality. Hostile is if you had, the atheist teacher badgering students about, why there's no God. That would actually be hostile to religion. And we would say that violates state-church separation, even if we might agree with some of the points that the teacher were making. But they obviously try to convert this, absence of endorsing religion or neutrality to religion as somehow being hostile, and that's not really what the Constitution requires or what the Constitution means in terms of the absence of promotion is not hostile.
Well, I think religion itself is the problem, because a really deep religious commitment can compromise your judgment. Even Jesus, if he existed in the New Testament, he said, you're either for me or you're either against me. He that is not with me is against me. He didn't see that you could be neutral. In his mind, and in the mind of a lot of believers, and maybe in Kavanaugh's mind, if you're not for religion 100%, then you're hostile, you're antagonistic to it. When actually in our country, we can have that beautiful middle ground that we call neutrality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that goes to a point that there's a larger trend to try to redefine religious liberty, because to their mind, that is the only way to look at it. You are either giving the brand of Christianity that they want a permanent a permanent access to spread their message, whether you're government actors or not, or else you're being hostile toward religion. That's the way they see it. They do not see this middle ground, which is what was on Thomas Jefferson's mind when he talked about the separation between church and state. This idea that we can set up a set of rules where the government doesn't tell anybody what to believe when it comes to religion. It's a pretty simple concept from a secularist perspective, but there's a concerted effort to try to redefine the idea of religious liberty to say that religious liberty means that if you are religious, or at least the right kind of religious, you have the right to not only believe, but also to say and to act in any way in accordance with your religious beliefs, regardless of your status as a government actor or not. And so we have a clip that where Senator Hirono in the hearings kind of touched on this topic.
She's from Hawaii?
Yes.
Senator from Hawaii?
Yes.
The free exercise clause of the First Amendment ensures that each person has a freedom of conscience to pursue their own religious values. These rights end where they would interfere with another's ability to do the same. However, in recent years, a wide range of individuals and institutions have received special dispensation to impose their beliefs in others, and of course, most notably, this is the Hobby Lobby versus Burwell case. So a case that raised those kinds of issues came before you in the Priest for Life. And in that case, one of the things you had to determine was whether there was a substantial burden on the employers. And their employers, their claim, the act of filling out a form to let their insurance company and Health and Human Services know that they had a religious objection, weren't going to cover the contraception, was overly burdensome. And it wasn't the priests who were providing the contraception coverage, a third party was. And the priests weren't forcing that third party to cover birth control. Congress was through the ACA. In your dissent, you thought that was too much. You said the employer's religious exercise was substantially burdensome and that they could deny contraceptive coverage to their employees. So my question to you is, do you believe that the freedom of religion clause supersedes other rights?
Yeah.
Did he answer that question?
He dodged it, basically, where he tried to first say that, well, if these if these priests weren't filling out their form, they were going to get this heavy fine, and so that was a huge burden, and so that's there is no conflict of rights there, which that's just what we call dissembling. That's not an accurate representation of what was going on. So he did not squarely answer the question of what happens when his view of religious liberty rights meet the rights of others. And I think that is very telling. It's really indicative that when that happens, he is extremely likely to be consistent in saying that the religious liberty rights of employers or small business owners are going to trump the rights of other people.
But it was nice to see somebody asking questions that we're concerned about at these hearings. How often did state church come up? Do you know?
Not too much. And actually, at first, I was a little bit disappointed because the Democratic senators, who were the ones asking kind of the harder-hitting questions, naturally, were not bringing it up. They had other things that were on their mind, so that's fair. But it was actually John Cornyn, the senator from Texas, who brought up the Santa Fe decision that we were talking about earlier, because he was the Solicitor General of Texas at the time.
And he's on the Republican side.
Yeah, that's right. And so he, unfortunately, they talked about state church, but he wasn't grilling him. He wasn't asking hard-hitting questions, but actually, in a way, I think that that was, it revealed more than hard-hitting questions would have, because when people like Senator Hirono are asking these questions, trying to nail him down on his inconsistencies and whatnot, then his defenses fly up and he dodges and gets out of it. But when John Cornyn brought it up and said, let's talk about state church, let's talk about Santa Fe and religious liberty, Kavanaugh opened up to him and said, you know, things are moving in a great direction, even though he didn't quite say that he thought Santa Fe was wrongly decided, even though that's crystal clear. Again, he filed a brief in that case on the losing side. He didn't exactly say that, but he said, you know, things are getting much better. If you look at more recent cases like Trinity Lutheran and Grease v. Galloway, things are really moving in a good direction in terms of protecting religious liberty.
Yeah, that hurricane is moving in a good direction.
Right, exactly. Yeah, for those of us who pay attention to state church, that's a scary thing for a Supreme Court nominee to be saying.
So there's more from Hirono.
So you determined that filling out a 2-page form was unduly burdensome. Did you know?
I concluded that penalizing someone thousands and thousands of dollars for failing to fill out a form when they didn't fill it out because of their religious beliefs was...
No, if they filled out a 2-page form, they could have been totally insulated from thousands and thousands of fines. So the question became not the fines, that was irrelevant. The question was whether a 2-page form was overly burdensome, and you determined it was overly burdensome. So, you know, it kind of defies logic to me.
She was right, basically, that it was irrelevant to bring up the fines as an answer to it.
That's right. And the notable point which she also hit on, and we were talking about this as well when we were first looking at Kavanaugh, is that not only did he say that filling out a 2-page form was a substantial burden on religious liberty for the Priests for Life, he also said that it was not an undue burden for a 17-year-old woman to carry a pregnancy that she had expressed a clear desire to terminate, and she went through all of the requirements to have that happen, to get her abortion, and he said, no, I'm going to make you wait longer, and I don't think that's an undue burden. So this concept, I think this really goes to showing how vacuous it often is when you hear judicial nominees that refuse to answer questions head on, and instead they just say, well, all I do is apply precedent. I just call balls and strikes. I'm a completely impartial person. I have no ideology that I apply to cases. That usually is a mask for what really I would say is just judicial activism. And this is a perfect example where these are two cases that both involve women's health care and both involve a standard of what is an undue burden. And so when it is a woman carrying a pregnancy that she doesn't want to carry to term, he will bend over backwards to say that is not an undue burden. You know, throwing up everything he can between her and getting her abortion. But when it's an employer who doesn't want to provide birth control, which, by the way, he wrongly refers to as abortion-inducing drugs, so that's a little side note. When it comes to that and filling out a 2-page form, he says, well, that would absolutely be a substantial burden on your religious liberty, so I'll stand up for the employer in that case. So that's very concerning.
Patrick, can you explain this doctrine or concept of how an undue burden relates to the government and religious liberty?
Right. Well, you know, in the Priests for Life case, which is what Senator Hirono had been, you know, asking about, that's actually mirrors kind of this free exercise analysis that courts do. But it was a case under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is a special law that Congress passed, which basically allows people to, if they allege that they have, you know, suffered some burden upon their religious exercise, then the government has to justify why it's permissible. And so basically they're claiming, which I don't think anybody really thought, that you know, under the Affordable Care Act, basically there were these exceptions carved out for the idea that a private employer might not, particularly a nonprofit, might not want to provide mandatory contraceptive coverage. So all they had to do was fill out a form and inform their insurer. And that is what we're talking about, is that a burden on somebody's religion? I don't think in our common thinking and talking about we don't see it that way.
Just writing out 4 things, that's a burden.
Right. And in the concept, under Roe versus Wade, state governments and other governments can't, basically unduly restrict access to abortion. And so that's that's where burden comes up in both cases, where Kavanaugh's position is clearly not congruent between the 2 cases, finding the filling out of a form being one, and access to abortion being not. And there's a number of cases after Roe versus Wade finding things that states have done to try to restrict abortion access as being an undue burden on a woman's right. Those are well established over law. What wasn't well established was this idea of filling out a form could possibly be an undue burden on religious exercise.
Well, wouldn't the priest say that by filling out this form we are participating, we are complicit in this whole idea that women are entitled to birth control, and we don't even want to have to do anything that nods even in that direction? That's an undue burden to them.
That's their argument.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that just doesn't fit with how we've ever envisioned religious exercise in this country.
Yeah, 'cause if that qualifies, then anything qualifies. Their argument is basically, I should get everything that I want without having to do anything. Even if you're going to give me a total exemption, but I have to fill out a form, that's not acceptable. You should give me the total exemption automatically without me having to do anything. And that's just, that there's no way that you can look at that and say this is a reasonable, neutral standard to respect religious liberty. It's nothing but demanding favored treatment for
So Kavanaugh, do you think Kavanaugh then is inserting his personal views into his judicial decision-making there?
Absolutely. And I think, and to her credit, Senator Hirono nailed him down for that, even though she couldn't get him to give straight answers. We have one more clip from this exchange where she really hits that point.
So even though you engage in a balancing test, in the case of Priests for Life, filling out a 2-page form was too much. But in the case of Garzon, it was not too much to have this young woman remain in custody and to be forced, as far as you're concerned, to wait around for foster parents to be found.
In each case, Senator, I was doing my best to apply the precedent on point.
See, that's the thing about following precedent, because, oftentimes your own perspective, a judge's ideological viewpoints, et cetera, come into play as to which precedent to apply, how to apply the precedent, and what parts of the precedent you want to apply.
So she's right about that too, right?
Yeah.
They always say, I'm going to be impartial, I'm going to judge the facts, I'm going to judge these cases based on the precedent. And yet she kind of stuck it to him, didn't she?
Yeah.
And he was in the dissent. He dissented in that case. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, clearly 2 other D.C. Circuit Court judges thought precedent did not, precedent actually came to the opposite conclusion. And so I think it's particularly hard to make that claim in a case where you're writing a dissent, saying that precedent required it.
Yeah, because it's one thing when occasionally you see judges who say, if I had a clean slate, I would rule differently, but the precedent is very clear and I'm bound to apply it, and so that's what they do. But this is different. This is a judge who looks at the situation, looks at the case, has 2 colleagues who say precedent dictates answer A, and he says, well, I'm saying answer B anyway. I'm not agreeing with you on the basis of precedent and saying I wish this weren't the precedent. I'm actually ruling the other way. And then when he gets cornered and asked why, all he can say is, well, I did my best to apply precedent.
So is he being deliberately dishonest, or do you think he's just compromised in his judgment on these issues?
I think it is deliberate dishonesty. He's too intelligent to not realize this sort of inconsistency. And I think it's in the mold of Antonin Scalia, who Gorsuch replaced, that he was kind of the arch original textualist, and there's a nice article that's I think called the incomprehensibleness of Antonin Scalia or something like that really highlights a lot of this, where it's a smokescreen to hide judicial activism when you and it is a skill. It takes a pretty clever, intelligent person to be able to twist precedent in the way that suits your needs. And something else you'll always hear Kavanaugh say is he says, applying precedent in light of history and tradition. And so that's a nice little out for him as well. Even when the precedent is really clearly against him, he can always find something in history that he says, well, this, when we're informed by the correct history, actually dictates the result that I want anyway. So I think that's the game that he's playing.
So theoretically, I think, theoretically, it shouldn't matter if there's liberals or conservatives on the court. Of course, people who are liberal want us to have liberals on the court, and people who are conservative want conservatives on the court. The fact that this even matters tells us a lot. And Kavanaugh's Roman Catholic. You were raised Roman Catholic,
yeah.
right? So
you keep bringing that up, Dan.
well, because isn't his Catholicism I mean, don't Roman Catholics owe a higher allegiance to something higher even than the U.S. Constitution?
Well,
and there's 6 of them on the court now, right?
Right. Well, obviously, you have people who've been involved in government. Like former President John Kennedy, who've acknowledged this. I mean, at the time, he was being attacked, saying he would be, allegiance to the Catholic Church, recognizing state-church separation. I think it is a concern here, though, because we've seen it, I think, borne out in some of the actions that Kavanaugh has done. For instance, he was heavily involved in defending public funding of religious schools. And so he worked with Jeb Bush in Florida and tried to implement, or he represented him in a case where there was a challenge to Florida's funding of religious schools through a voucher program, and the Florida Supreme Court ruled that program violated the Florida Constitution. And so I think the idea that basically Catholic schools and private parochial schools would benefit greatly from some of these decisions, I think is borne out in what he's doing, or again, referring to contraceptives as abortion-inducing drugs. I mean, these are the type of language you'd see from a pro-life website, not from somebody seeking to be on the Supreme Court. So I don't think, certainly we wouldn't say that anybody's religion is a disqualifier. It's just interesting that we don't really have a pluralistic Supreme Court. We have a very Catholic Supreme Court right now.
But to be fair, Sotomayor is Catholic too, right? And she tends to rule more progressive on these things.
She's out. I think in all the state church cases, she's always issued very vigorous dissents when it was required, just given the makeup of the court. So you're right, it's not. I don't think it's anything. Don't hold it against us former Catholics or Catholics.
You got to do a lot of penance, Patrick, to work here at FFRF. You have to.
But I mean, it's an interesting perspective that people bring their religious background with them, when they're on the court, and we've seen, how he's treated litigants hasn't shown that he's really necessarily able to divorce his personal opinions from what the law requires.
Yeah, and I think this raises an issue that this came up in a different judicial confirmation hearing for Amy Coney Barrett, who's a Trump appointee to the 7th Circuit, where Senator Dianne Feinstein got a lot of heat for asking about this exact issue. She said, you are. Not only are you a Catholic, but she said something like the dogma is strong within you, or something to those effects. And a lot of people thought, isn't this a religious test for public office? Is she not saying Catholics are not fit to be judges? And so it's really important to be clear that that's not what she was saying, and it's, I know, not what we're saying either. There's never a disqualifying religious test. It's just that if you have a history of placing your religious dogma above your secular duties, and you would be unable to carry out your duties as a neutral secular government officer, then that's a major problem.
Because they're all religious. I mean, as far as we know, they're all religious on the court. Before we take questions, I think there's questions today from viewers. Either of you, what is FFRF doing about Kavanaugh? What are we doing to...
So we've been doing a lot. One thing is that we signed on to a letter with other groups of the Secular Coalition of America, which actually was entered into the record during the hearing. So that's a nice contribution, that if you look at the official record of Kavanaugh's confirmation hearing, FFRF is right there, explaining a lot of the concerns that we've been talking about today. And then, in addition to that, from the moment that he was nominated, we have been informing our members about our concerns and what they can do to take action to help oppose Kavanaugh. And so, which, by the way, we'll mention again later, but the easiest way to sign up for those action alerts, if you're interested in that, is to text FFRF to 52886. And so we've been really active when the time is right to put pressure on senators to say, these are my concerns, and why, if you don't get good answers to these questions, you should really not vote to confirm this guy, we blast that out to our members, and we have a really cool automated system where you can basically just click a button and it'll connect you directly to your senator.
So some of us might think, not me, but some of us might think, why bother? Isn't the confirmation pretty much inevitable? I mean, can we still do something about it?
Yeah, we absolutely still can. Yeah, I mean, there are a number of senators who are still officially on the fence about the Kavanaugh confirmation. So I think at a minimum, what people should do is look up your two senators, see where they are, and especially if you have one who is not solidly decided, you should be just full pressure on at this point. And there are a lot of things. So for instance, there's Susan Collins, I know recently, is coming under a whole new barrage of pressure based on Roe v. Wade concerns. So it's a live issue for sure.
And it's not, I think it's not based on pure hope. I mean, because this, the Kavanaugh, at least in terms of polling from the public, basically his disapproval rating, if you will, or basically support, matched, I think, was Robert Bork, who ultimately had his nomination withdrawn. So it's not the same as, we've been through both, both under George W. Bush and under Obama, a number of Supreme Court, justices who ultimately got approved and who had larger public support. There is a large amount of public concern over Kavanaugh, and I agree that I don't think all senators are definitive.
Right.
Certainly it's an uphill battle, but that doesn't mean it's insurmountable.
Yeah.
Well, this is our country, right? So we need to speak up. We do have some questions here from viewers. Matthew R. Hogan asks, is there anything regular citizens or atheists can do to stop the nomination? Is there any particular law preventing his nomination? I don't think so. I think we've covered this, haven't we?
Right. I think Ryan hit it. I mean, there is an issue potentially of concern of, he had gone through a confirmation process, I believe in 2006 when he was appointed to the D.C. Circuit, and some senators or others have pointed out questioning whether he had ever engaged in perjury in terms of his answers to questions. So, as citizens, I think your option is to contact your senators to oppose. If he's confirmed and if he's lied about things, I think potentially, the Senate may, call him. He may be impeached if he actually has done that. I don't know whether that is true or not. It's something that people have raised because of what we now have in terms of documents versus what his answers were at the time.
Well, that would be a crime, then.
Right.
Yeah,
So.
well, and also disqualifying. So even if he wasn't in the Supreme Court, it would kick him off of the D.C. Circuit. But the other thing to keep in mind is that the impeachment process requires a very solid majority of Congress agreeing on the impeachment. So it is a much easier battle to try to get him not confirmed. You only need 51 votes there.
Okay, so Maggie, how do you say your name, Maggie? Maggie Boages? She asks, how do you think that Kavanaugh will rule on cases pertaining towards religious liberty for religious minorities?
Well, I actually had, we had a little bit of a preview for this past Supreme Court term when Trump had announced he was going to have a Muslim travel ban. And that case went before some courts of appeals who actually ruled that that ban was unconstitutional. It went to the Supreme Court, and they basically let it fly. There's a religious minority, Muslims, who the president had unequivocally said weren't going to be allowed to have visas or to travel from certain countries into the United States. And as a part of that case, we found the justices really didn't give full regard to the religious liberty of a particular minority that was targeted. I would envision Kavanaugh issuing similar rulings as that. I don't think there's any way he would go along with a ruling like that, where a targeted religious minority, instead of ruling properly that they have been, that their rights, this was an Establishment Clause violation, that they had basically been given disfavored status because of their religion and the country of origin, that he would bend over backwards to find that to be permissible.
Did somebody ask him about that in the hearings? Did that come up?
I don't know that it exactly did, because he would have just completely dodged it. When you ask him about a specific case or a hypothetical, he's just going to completely dodge it. So I don't remember if a religious minority question directly came up. One thing I would point out in terms of history of people who are judicially similar to Kavanaugh is if you look at Scalia in the Employment Division versus Smith case, for instance, that was a situation where a religious liberty question came up. As a free exercise case about some practitioners of a Native American religion they were drug counselors, they wanted to take peyote, but that violated drug law, and they said we should have an exemption to this. And Scalia was among the majority who said, no, you don't get an exemption for that. And so I think that's an example of what I was mentioning earlier, where when you're a textual originalist who applies history and tradition, it's pretty easy to twist that into protecting the people you want to protect and finding a way that those protections don't apply to minority groups. And so that wasn't Kavanaugh, and we shouldn't say that he's the same as Scalia, but if I had to predict, I would expect to see some mental gymnastics like that.
Smith peyote case was the catalyst for the RFRA, right, for Religious Freedom Restoration Act.
That's right.
Which has been used to justify not just religious freedom, but religious privilege around the country.
Yep.
Okay, a couple more questions. Doug Roberts, I can pronounce that last name very well, Roberts. For us foreigners, where are you from, Doug? He speaks English anyway. For us foreigners, can you briefly explain exactly who Kavanaugh is? I'm not entirely understanding who he is and why he's been the subject of the discussion. What does being nominated to fill the U.S. Supreme Court mean? Well, you really are a foreigner.
I know, wow. Wow. I mean, we can give, I guess, not the 101 version of this that he wants, maybe a little higher level. But, I mean, he is a current judge on the D.C. Court of Appeals, which oftentimes has been deemed to be a bit of a feeder circuit court for our U.S. Supreme Court.
It's a federal court. Yes.
Right. An interesting thing about Kavanaugh in terms of, who he is, he has, much more tight Republican ties, just given his involvement both in the George W. Bush White House. He's kind of tied to, I think, Senator Dick Durbin called him the Forrest Gump of Republican attorneys, because he was always running to whatever the crisis was at the time. So apparently he had some involvement in things like the Elian Gonzalez case, representing the family to try to keep him in the United States. Again, representing Jeb Bush and trying to keep vouchers within Florida. And so I guess if I was explaining to somebody who he is, I would say I would affiliate him with the Republican Party, just given his several decades of work that he's done. He is a judge, a current judge, and is seeking our highest court.
And I would also just add that the other thing that we haven't mentioned that is on a lot of people's minds of concern with Kavanaugh is that he has come out, he was involved in the impeachment investigation with Bill Clinton, and then after working in the George W. Bush White House, he kind of changed his perspective and had writings saying that he doesn't think that the president should ever be subject to investigation. So a lot of people think that may be why he was an attractive nominee for President Trump with his current ongoing investigation. So people are really concerned about that as a potential, there's a potential appearance of impropriety there with that concern too.
And just to be really obvious to Doug, who's a foreigner, our president nominates someone to be on our highest court, and then the Senate confirms that. And that's what we're going through right now, the confirmation process to confirm or deconfirm or to accept the person for the highest court.
Yep.
Final question. Okay. Kate Goddard asks, won't people be surprised when these deeply held religious beliefs that Kavanaugh is going to uphold aren't the same ones that they personally follow? There's so many different traditions and ways to be a Christian. Even Christians can't agree on what the Bible says. So how can he use his religious beliefs to justify legal decisions? Well, he's not saying he's doing that. Right? He's not saying I'm using my religious beliefs. But we are suggesting or intimating that, of course, that's exactly what he's doing. Because how can you not, if you're a deeply religious person, how can you set that totally aside.
Yeah, and I think it's well said, and it goes to the point that if Kavanaugh gets confirmed, we're going to be in this bizarre situation where there's going to be a solid majority of 5 on the Supreme Court that have kind of old school, sincerely held religious beliefs that they are going to be pumping into the body of federal law, and at the same time, we have an American demographic that is shifting steadily away from that. So when you have not only more atheists, more agnostics, more just non-religious people in general, but also even religious people are moving away from the idea that that the government should be banning gay marriage or all these other things that have, 20, 30 years ago, you had this more of a united front of religious Americans, and now that's not true anymore at all. People's beliefs really are changing, and so I think they're going to be really going against the grain when you're going to get these, presumably in the worst case scenario, these consistent decisions coming down, upholding the religious morality from 50 years ago.
I think Kate's question goes to the point that Trump has been catering to the evangelical religious right in this country, and he's been promising them all of these things. He says, I will nominate justices who will overturn Roe. But a lot of religious people are very liberal, as you pointed, and there's even Catholics for choice. I mean, there's liberal, not necessarily liberal, but there are Roman Catholics and others who don't hold Kavanaugh's particular narrow, perhaps Vatican-centered Catholic point of view.
I mean, I think the other, point of the question is a little bit, be careful what you wish for, because as we know, as any Supreme Court case comes down, the lower courts are obligated to follow that. And so I know, for instance, of a case that's going on now, and I don't even know its current status, where a religious person had pointed out that they feel obligated to provide basically shelter to immigrants crossing the border. And they're being prosecuted for that because this would be violation of some immigration laws. And so they're saying, my religion compels me to, care for this person. And so those are the types of cases that may eventually, will have to eventually be decided by courts. But I think it's a little bit, be careful what you wish for. If this idea that, people's religions are going to be able to get them out of, get out of jail free card for laws, that's not going to play out one way. There will be other, cases that will come forward that conservatives may not agree with.
So in those cases with the more progressive churches, where is the undue burden? I mean, who's being unduly burdened?
Well, they're actually getting prosecuted. Well, at least there's one individual that, as I understand, is being prosecuted. So, basically, he's threatened with jail if he provides shelter to people that are coming across the border. I think there's a much stronger, that's a much stronger claim that he's got a burden. Then that would then shift to, well, does the government have a compelling interest in restricting it and have to use the least restrictive means? So I think that person would certainly meet the first tier, and then you'd have to go to these other tiers that courts look at.
So don't we all kind of think that the best solution here is a government where state and church are totally separate, where people are free to believe what they want, but the government stays religiously neutral?
Right, and that's what we'd ask of the Supreme Court. I mean, certainly there are other organizations that are trying to bring cases before the court that are concerned for that separation.
Well, thank you guys. You're going to get back to watching the rest of the hearings then?
The hearings are over, fortunately, so I get to go back to being a normal lawyer.
Oh, you get to go back? Okay, good, okay. Well, we should look at your notes. You've probably been taking copious notes about us. Well, thank you, Patrick Elliott and Ryan Jane, attorneys here at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And thank you for watching. That's our show for today. And don't forget our upcoming convention in San Francisco. It'll be November 2nd through the 4th. The speakers at the convention will be the eminent writer, Salman Rushdie. And next to him there on the screen is the former director of Planned Parenthood, Cecile Richards. And then there's the Mythbusters host, Adam Savage. He'll be at our convention. The actor, John Delancey, who is of Star Trek fame. He'll be there. Then Sarah Hyder, who's with Ex-Muslims of North America. Sarah Hyder. The winning stand-up comedian, Leanne Lord. And the irreverent actress and one of our best friends, Saturday Night Live alumnus, Julia Sweeney.
Also appearing at the convention will be Ensaf Hader, the activist wife of a Saudi freethinker whose persecution and imprisonment have caused global outrage. You can register online at ffrf.org/outreach/convention.
And if you would like to receive FFRF text alerts on your smartphone, text FFRF to 52886. Data rates may apply. Again, FFRF to 52886.
So we'll see you again next week for another episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist.